2015 may have produced the landmark nuclear deal, but 2021 may be the year that sees it resurrected. April in Vienna has been the scene of talks between current parties to the deal and America. That's to say, the P4+1 parties are trying to help the US back into the nuclear deal, or JCPOA, so that Iran will fully recommit and the deal is reset to how it started out 6 years ago. Oh, but in the midst of talks, Iran's main nuclear power plant came under a terror attack, presumably to weaken Iran's hand at the negotiating table by taking away its leverage. Will the saboteurs be given the satisfaction, or will the world's most prominent nations keep sharp and conclude the Vienna talks with results before any more spanners can be put into the works, and while Iran's present government is still presiding nuclear deal talks? I'm Leila Faramarzi and you're watching Iran Today. Nobody has directly taken responsibility for the attack on Natanz nuclear enrichment site, but Israeli media has been filled with claims from unnamed officials claiming responsibility. And Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed not to see the deal revived. There is no room for doubt the saboteur was Israel. Wouldn't be the first time. How did it bust Iran's IR-1 centrifuges at the underground Natanz site? And would it dare go ahead without US backing? Mr. Marandi is Professor of International Studies, frequenting major international news channels. He says,
without a doubt, the attack was carried out with American knowledge and American support. It's impossible that the Israeli regime would carry out such an attack at such a sensitive time without prior American knowledge. And the American Secretary of Defense was on his way to Tel Aviv when it was carried out. So no serious person would accept that the Israeli regime just carried out this attack on its own.
That is correct in all its madness and contradiction. American aid to the Israeli sabotage is in direct conflict with the nature of the talks. The nuclear deal, or JCPOA talks, are to convince Iran of American goodwill, of America's intention to lift sanctions off this country so that Iran can recomply and willingly slow down its civilian nuclear program. Instead, Natanz came under what Iran's nuclear agency branded nuclear terrorism. Mr. Rezvanpur is a political analyst who's been keeping close watch of JCPOA developments. He welcomed us at his home. Iran appears okay with not achieving what's intended from the Vienna talks. But would you say it's possible that all parties equally enter the JCPOA, re-enter?
The ongoing talks, which is being held at Vienna with the representatives of Iran and 4+1 groups, they have just held different kinds of meetings during the past couple of weeks. But the results of the meeting has not been shown to the public up to now. The reason why it has not been concluded is that the West is persisting on its own demand. In international relationships, we have a principle. They say, what is mine, and what is yours is negotiable.
Mr. Mackey is a political analyst with all the details. He visited Press TV studios to share his views. Thing is, parties to the JCPOA don't have any more time to drag their feet along. So, are we going to get results? Are the US and Iran going to resurrect the JCPOA?
The behavior and reaction of the European and American governments show that they have the political will to lift the sanctions and return to their obligations under the JCPOA. But reviving the deal isn't limited to Iran and the United States. There are actors inside Washington, Tehran, and also the region and the whole world that can play negative or positive roles in the process of talks. This has made the talks quite complicated. We can't expect anything extraordinary to happen in the short term.
The contradiction comes in brighter light as we look at Iran's reaction. Rather than getting blackmailed into even indirect talks with the US, it just immediately took to further and faster uranium enrichment. It is no longer settling for 20% enrichment, but is set to enrich uranium up to 60% purity, and it will be replacing the old damaged centrifuges with more advanced IR-6 models. That will significantly increase its enrichment capacity. Well, the US just hasn't come to know Iran in 40 years and more. What's troubling is that the Europeans haven't condemned Israel's actions. Why would you say Iran's European partners in the JCPOA didn't condemn Israel's act of sabotage?
Anywhere in the world, they are controlling different kinds of politicians in the US, in Europe. So they didn't condemn Israeli act. And this action overshadowed, the process of negotiations between Iranian representative and 4+1 group. In my opinion, the Western governments must condemn Israel because they committed, as I stated before, they committed a nuclear terrorism in our nuclear facilities.
German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas expressed concern that the attack could affect the talks by saying, "All of what we're hearing from Tehran is not a positive contribution to this." All of what we're hearing from Tehran. Thing is, they might hear something more positive if they heed Iran's natural expectation to have the act of terror on Natanz condemned. The German minister's comments came as US Defense Secretary Austin and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken prepared to meet their counterparts in Brussels for talks with European and NATO allies, likely to touch on Iran.
Well, we have to keep in mind that Western intelligence agencies, NATO intelligence agencies, and the Israelis, they're all working together. It's not as if it's one against one or two against one. Western embassies are sometimes involved. Even people working in the media are sometimes involved. People working in the International Atomic Energy Agency have been involved.
Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif sent a letter to the UN Security Council asking it to hold Israel accountable. He tweeted, "Deliberate targeting of a safeguarded nuclear facility with high risk of indiscriminate release of radioactive material is nuclear terrorism and a war crime." Iran also delivered a letter to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, urging it to condemn the attack. The IAEA is the United Nations nuclear watchdog that monitors Iran's nuclear program more than any other.
Iran just asked the Western sides to condemn this kind of, Israeli action in its own nuclear facilities, but never Western authorities didn't answer and they didn't just stated any response. So it was their fault, in my opinion. Even at the negotiating table, they didn't issue a statement condemning Israeli action regarding this sabotage act in Natanz nuclear facilities. And the Western countries, 4+1 group, should issue a statement, condemn Israeli actions, because it is our own right under Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
The purpose of the JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran nuclear deal, was to limit Iran's civilian nuclear program by lifting nuclear-related economic UN sanctions off this country. But the US under Donald Trump unilaterally pulled out of the deal in 2018 and reimposed and reinforced UN sanctions as US sanctions. Europeans failed to help Iran in spite of this country's compliance with the deal. So, Iran started reversibly stepping out of its commitments and awaiting respite. Even this it did in line with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and the JCPOA Articles 26 and 36. Time to give other outlets a chance to get a word in. So let's take leave of our narrative for a bit for a quick media review. And here's the words they put it in. Looking at TRT World, the intentions behind the Natanz terror attack could have backfired to benefit Iran's diplomatic efforts at Vienna. Nuclear terrorism in Natanz threatens diplomacy in Vienna. Given Tel Aviv's record of lobbying the US to take military action against Iran, it is hardly surprising that the Israelis would be keen to remind all in the region and beyond that there are options outside of diplomacy for addressing Iran's nuclear activity. The Israeli Prime Minister wants the world to know that his country will not sit by idly as talks in Vienna progress, with almost all actors in the international community hoping for a successful revival of the JCPOA. In attacking the nuclear facility in Natanz, however, Israel might be undermining its anti-diplomacy agenda. This attack could increase the resolve of diplomats in Europe who are attempting to save the nuclear accord before Iran's upcoming presidential election. The attack will undoubtedly push all parties involved to redouble their efforts in finding a resolution during the ongoing negotiations in Vienna, according to foreign policy analyst Mehran Haqirian. Iran will use this issue as leverage in the negotiations and at the same time further advance its nuclear program in contradiction to the JCPOA until an agreement is reached in Vienna. Tehran Times tells of how Iran will be responding to the Natanz sabotage. "We will avenge sabotage in Natanz in the aggressor's land," says government. Speaking at his weekly press briefing, Ali Rabi condemned the terrorist attack at the Natanz nuclear site and stressed that action against the Natanz nuclear site shows the defeat of the enemies of Iran's industrial and political progresses. Noting that Iran reserves the right to take action against the perpetrators of the attack, he said, Iran, while condemning this move, urges the international community to respond to this nuclear terrorism. To thwart this goal, the Iranian government will continue to seriously pursue the development of nuclear technology and work to lift sanctions. Rabi, the government spokesman, said, "This sabotage action is intended to prevent the country's development on the one hand and successful negotiations to lift the cruel sanctions on the other." The government spokesman stressed that Iran will retaliate at the appropriate time and with proportionate intensity, but we will not allow the enemies to achieve their political goals. One question remained unanswered. How was the terror attack conducted? Israel would have us believe it was a cyber attack. Here's what Reuters says. Iran identifies suspects behind blast at Natanz nuclear site. Iran on Saturday, April the 17th, named a man it once arrested in connection with a recent explosion and power outage at its main Natanz nuclear plant, as talks got underway in Vienna to try to save Tehran's 2015 nuclear deal with world powers. Reza Karimi, the perpetrator of this sabotage, has been identified by Iran's intelligence ministry, state TV said. It said the suspect had fled Iran before April the 11th blast that the Islamic Republic has blamed on arch-foe Israel. The television showed what it said was a photograph of the suspected perpetrator on a red card that had Interpol Wanted written on it. The card listed his age as 43. Necessary steps are underway for his arrest and return to the country through legal channels, the report added. And that would be it for the news segment. Back to our narration. Cyber attack or infiltration and physical harm. Perhaps cyber attack by infiltration. Natanz was targeted also in July. An explosion ripped apart an advanced centrifuge assembly plant at the site. Hence, Iran said it would rebuild the site deep inside a nearby mountain. That's yet another instance to suspect Israel for, in addition to a string of incidents including assassinations stretched over the past decade. Looking at Israel's terror attack on Natanz, how do you see the Vienna talks ending?
The Vienna talks over the past week following the Natanz incident have seen many ups and downs. The United States and Europe's positions toward the developments have been something of a double standard. Attacking a country's nuclear facilities is unacceptable anywhere in the world. If this trend continues, it could pose a threat to regional and global security. The world's nuclear nations have signed agreements and memoranda in this regard and have established a red line for the security of nuclear facilities around the world, because they are well aware that if the nuclear security of the facilities is threatened, it will not be limited to that country or region.
Not only was the act not condemned by European parties to the deal, they further boycotted Iran at the same time. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi quoted himself in telling the European Union, "We told them that even your human rights sanctions that you imposed 2 days ago we consider as JCPOA-related sanctions, because right in the middle of negotiations you decided to impose sanctions, and that is certainly meant to undermine the current negotiations and to undermine the JCPOA altogether." Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. Natanz found itself first targeted by a major cyber attack in the late 2000s, which is why the recent incident was readily suspected also to be a cyber attack. The first incident was by a virus. The virus, called Stuxnet, attacked control units for centrifuges at Natanz, causing the sensitive devices to spin out of control and destroy themselves. Experts widely believe the attack was carried out by America and Israel, as does Iran. Natanz is ground zero for cyber war. It's the place where the world's first real cyber attack took place a decade ago. The joint US-Israel operation.
Israeli authorities are afraid of Iran becoming a nuclear power in peaceful manner. That's why they are committing different kinds of sabotage acts. Again, I'm repeating, during these times of negotiations, they are not willing Iran to become a party of 4+1 group. That's why they are trying to prevent Iran from getting a compromise, from reaching a compromise with its own parties.
The thing with the recent, that Sunday the 11th April attack on Natanz, is that it's not just Reuters anymore, but more and more reports pointing towards an explosion at the power supply rather than simply a cyber attack. Going by precedents, however, whatever the reason, it will only be a temporary setback for Iran's nuclear program. Still, even a simple blackout is not harmless at a nuclear site. Centrifuges are slender machines linked up in cascades which enrich uranium gas by spinning it at incredibly high speeds using rotors. The stress on the advanced materials involved is intense, and the process is technically immensely challenging. A small problem can send a centrifuge spinning out of control, with parts smashing into each other and damaging a whole cascade. I asked our experts how they predicted the outcome of the Vienna talks.
It's not unlikely that the US would take a serious stance about lifting sanctions, considering the rise of tensions in the US-Russia relations on the one hand, and the tensions between Washington and Beijing on the other, and the US effort to counter China and Russia. So it has become more likely for them to seek an agreement with Iran. That being said, the parties who are opposed to JCPOA have adopted destructive policies that could affect the process of the agreement's revival. Israel's terrorist activities are part of that.
P4 JCPOA member state China is aware of the situation. Wang Kun, its head of delegation to Vienna, called for a faster pace and fewer distractions. Western parties can't not have been secretly pleased to see Iran's hand weakened. To see this country stripped of its leverage, its nuclear advancement, that is. Thing is, Iran never was stripped of anything. It's just picking up its nuclear program where it left off, and even without that, in attending the Vienna talks, it never meant to resurrect the deal at any cost. The idea was, the US will lift all sanctions in a single stroke. Only then will Iran scale back its nuclear enrichment levels in recompliance with the nuclear deal, and only after verifying that sanctions have really been lifted. That can take 6 months.
The reason why the US didn't represent at the negotiating table was that it was Iran's demand that the US Rob Malley should not be a representative of 4+1 at the negotiating table. It was Iranian request, and it was a great achievement for Iranian negotiators at the negotiating table. So, in my opinion, we must persist on our own demands. I mean, we should not get back. We should just move forward, insist on our request, insist on our demands to remove all sanctions at the same time, completely without any precondition. And after that, there should be a safeguarding, agreements between Iran and 4+1 or 5+1. Because in future, if Israel commit this kind of acts, we have to have a mechanism in order to respond to this Israeli act of sabotage.
You see, the attack on the Natanz nuclear facility a few months back and the recent attempt show there's a security gap in Iran that the Israelis can exploit and infiltrate to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists and damage nuclear facilities. Well, this is a negative point. But the other point that should be noted about Iran's nuclear program is that it has become indigenous. Israel cannot be more wrong to think that an attack on a nuclear facility could hinder Iran's efforts and prolong the Vienna talks or even result in the JCPOA's demise. But that didn't happen.
Sabotage and crime stretched over a decade, all leaving behind a trail of Israeli footprints. Here's the sum of lives lost. 5 scientists in 10 years, plus in some cases their companions. By end November 2020, at least 4 nuclear scientists had been killed in vehicle bombings and shootouts, and several others had been targeted but survived. Those killed with martyr status are Masoud Ali Mohammadi, Majid Shahriari, Dariush Rezai-Nejad, Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, and most recently on the 27th of November 2020, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Both the US and Israel denied involvement. Fereydun Abbasi was wounded end 2010, but he survived after being rushed to hospital. The most recent sabotage of the nuclear program followed Iran's unveiling of its nuclear achievements, which are of great use for medical purposes, say making medicine. The unveiling happened on National Nuclear Technology Day, April the 10th, 2021. Saturday, April the 10th, saw an exhibition of 133 technological innovations with civilian and medical uses. In Isfahan's Natanz alone, the order was given to feed gas to 164 all-Iranian IR-6 centrifuges, slated to be mass-produced on an industrial level. Also, mechanical tests began on the top-of-the-line IR-9 centrifuge that has a separative capacity of 50 SWU. And a unit to assemble and evaluate advanced centrifuges was launched. There, the presenting engineer said more than half of all operations are currently industrialized. Natanz, where the country's largest nuclear facilities are located, is in central Iran. 3 major nuclear sites apart from Natanz are the Arak heavy water reactor facility, Bushehr nuclear power plant, and Fordo enrichment site. Ill will surrounds JCPOA talks even by some Arab neighbors, although, according to insiders, technical talks would continue at the expert level in the areas of sanctions and nuclear enrichment. Also, bilateral meetings would continue on the sidelines.
Iran's antagonists, regimes like Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're facing major problems. We see in Yemen that the Saudis are being badly defeated alongside the Emirates. And when their overlords, the Americans and the Europeans, are having their own problems, that basically means that Iran's influence rises. The influence of Iran's allies rise. So if the Americans want to continue hostility with Iran and to continue with heightened tensions, then they're going to have to spend more trillions of dollars in this region at a time when they cannot compete with the Chinese.
Apparently, parties have come to a considerable understanding, finally. As of Monday, April the 19th, here's what was tweeted by Mikhail Ulyanov. That's Russia's permanent representative to organizations in Vienna. Summing up the results of 2 weeks of deliberations on JCPOA restoration, we can note with satisfaction that the negotiations entered the drafting stage. Practical solutions are still far away, but we have moved from general words to agreeing on specific steps towards the goal. That's it for today, but there's plenty more to follow, so do return to the box at the same times next week and each week after. From me and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.